Hello and welcome to your mod spotlight over Kerbal Inventory System by Kospy with models and textures from Winn75. This mod basically adds an inventory for all of your Kerbals, as well as storage containers that have larger inventories, and even the ability to attach and detach parts from your crafts in flight. So let's hop in the VAB and look at what parts this mod adds. Kerbal Inventory System adds three primary parts: the SM62 container mount, which attaches radially and allows you to attach the actual container to it so you can detach it and attach it without the need of an engineer Kerbal with power tools. So if we go into the action menu and actually left click on this, you can see release. And of course, any Kerbal in flight can reattach it, and we'll see that in a minute. But let's actually grab the container and talk about that, the SC62 container, or the small container. Now the containers don't do much until you actually right click on them, when you have a single option called inventory. And when you left click on that, you'll hear a neat container opening sound, and now we can actually see the container. Now this interface allows us to start putting parts into it. Let's say we need some parachutes. If we left click on this radial parachute and hold down left click, then you'll notice our mouse cursor has become a thumbnail of that parachute. And of course, when we drag and drop, meaning we release the left click over one of these inventory slots, we actually place it into the inventory. Now this parachute has 85.65 liters in volume. So what happens when you run out of space on these containers? Well, let's put this part in, which has 900 liters of space, which almost maxes us out, and let's try to put another radial parachute in. We'll get a little warning that tells us we still need about 70 liters of space if we're going to add anything else into this container. Now, also note that the cost of this container, if you look down here, and if you mouse over the actual container into the VAB, you'll see that the cost is 420. So the container matches its cost, but if we add something like the RTG generator, which cost is 23,300, and we put one of these in, you'll notice the cost has now skyrocketed, and the mass has also gone up, which makes them fair and also makes them work with other mods such as stage recovery, because when this part is recovered, it'll actually recover all of the funds that the part actually costs, since this part's cost is dynamically changing. Now what you can also do is, if you're going to stick, say, a bunch of RTG generators in this container and you don't want to lose track of which container is which, you can actually set a name for it. So we can set the name as, let's say, RTG, and now that we have the name set, if we ever were to close this inventory, when we right click on the part, you'll see inventory RTG, which is our tag we just gave it. So now that we know this part is RTG generators, if we're interested in that, we can open it up. If not, then we can just leave it closed and actually look for the container we're looking for. Another amazing feat of Kerbal Inventory System is the ability that the inventories can hold onto metadata. So if we right click on this nice small RCS fuel tank we have, and we lower the amount of monopropellant it has, say we lower it down to 24 instead of 80, and then we left click and drag this part from in the editor scene, and we copy it into our inventory, you'll notice that the monopropellant is 24 out of 80 there on the right. And of course, its mass is changed accordingly. So the resource mass is 0.096, whereas if we were to grab a full one and drag it in, it would be 0.32. Now the volume is the same because the container, of course, has not changed size, just the amount of monopropellant in it. Other than the two different sizes of containers, where you have the large container, which holds 20,000 liters, or the small container, which holds 1,000 liters, you also have a third type of container. The third type of container is actually the Kerbal's inventory. So if we right click on the Mark II lander can, we see we have Seat 0 inventory and Seat 1 inventory. Those two inventories align up to who's sitting where. So Seat 0 would be Jebediah, and Seat 1 would be Bill. And if we were to swap these two around, then Bill now becomes Seat 0 on the inventory. Let's actually open up one of these inventories. So we'll open up Seat 0. Now this is the smallest inventory by far because it's as much as the Kerbal can carry while they're on EVA, which is 300 liters. Now the mass and cost are only because the part is holding the inventory until the kerbals get put into the part, which means that if we were to take something like, let's go get those parachutes again. If we were to put a parachute in one of these inventories, so Jebediah or Bob now has a parachute, then if we actually neglected to bring them, meaning that we didn't actually take seat 0 with us, this parachute wouldn't go anywhere, because the inventory gets placed into the Kerbal when they jump on EVA. Until then, it's basically in the ship, kind of like the Kerbal is. But just because of the way it works, if you actually want to have access to these inventories, you need to bring the Kerbals along. Otherwise, you won't have access to them. So we do need to bring around Jebediah and Bill if we want access to the 2 inventories in this lander can. If we don't bring them, then we can't actually use this inventory. Although we can put stuff in it, we just can't access it because the Kerbals aren't there. So now that we actually have the Kerbals inventory open, let's take a look at this new tab that's been added from Kerbal Inventory System called EVA Items. Now, EVA Items come with a few different tools. Let's start with the simplest, which is the KIS User Guide. Now, this can be used on in-flight as well as in the VAB by simply right-clicking it, and you'll notice we have an action called Read. Now, what the KIS User Guide is a very nicely constructed PDF document that just goes over all of the different things you can do with KIS. For example, inventory and parts transfer. There's one back here about the VAB, which is exactly what I just talked about, that you can put in a tank with no fuel in it, and then you can stick it in the inventory. And it tells you all of this, as well as nice tips here at the bottom that give you additional information. So if you're brand new to Kerbal Inventory System, I do recommend this is the first place you go to kind of check out everything you can do in every little detail, some things you might not know. As well as if you go to the last page, you'll actually get a list of all the hotkeys that you use when you're playing with Kerbal Inventory System. So let's close out of this, and we'll keep that in there just so if we actually open up seat 1, we can open up Bob's inventory because we're going to be using him. We'll put one of these books in there so we don't forget anything, just in case we might need it. Now, the next part we'll look at is the wrench. What the wrench basically allows you to do is it lets you add parts. It lets you take them off of vessels as well as attach them to vessels. Now, the wrench does the exact same thing that the screwdriver does, just in kind of a cheaper method. If you see that this one costs $650 and this one costs $100, as well as there being a small mass difference. But the screwdriver has a little bit more functionality, so we're going to take one of those, and I'll talk about the difference when we actually see what the part really does when we're adding and attaching things. Now, EVA propellant, we'll grab one of these. Basically, it's a small canister of EVA propellant. It means that your Kerbals can pick this thing up and actually refuel their EVA suit with this propellant so that they don't have to jump back in the command seat, or in case they're too far away from the command seat, they can't jump back in to refuel. Next, you have explosives, which allow you to attach them to vessels and right-click on them with a Kerbal to detonate them and destroy debris. Now, explosives are a little bit different when you put them in an inventory because they stack. So if you notice there's a small ×1 on there, if you right-click on this, you'll actually be allowed to set a quantity. And if you use Shift, you can up the quantity by 10, and if you use Control, you can up it by 100. So if we wanted, we could bring 130 explosives with us on some trip that a Kerbal can carry all by himself. That does seem a tad bit excessive, so I think we'll just drop this down to 20, although we'll probably only use 2 or 3 in the demonstration. Just a thing to note, I have a container here on a mount, and I'm going to radially attach it in Symmetry mode. So we have 2x Symmetry. Now, even with 2x Symmetry, if you open up the inventory, and maybe the second inventory, then they don't actually follow the symmetry in their inventory. So if you put one in one, it doesn't affect the other one. And if you actually have your inventory that has a part in it, so this is the one with our RTG generator, if we actually pick this one up and replace it in Symmetry mode, then it doesn't actually make the inventory share the part. This one keeps the part, however, only the inventory, the basic part, is mimicked. It's not the part's inventory that gets mimicked by Symmetry. So you can't save these parts with Symmetry. However, if you go into your settings menu and you go to sub-assemblies, and you actually take your part that has, say, an inventory, so we have one RTG generator in here, if we actually pick this part up and create a sub-assembly for it, so we can call this the RTG box, and we save it, we can actually save the inventory in there. So let's delete this. So now we have no box here that has an RTG generator in it. If we actually pull this part out and we place it, then what you'll notice is we have an RTG generator in it. And in the second one, like I said, Symmetry doesn't follow, so it's not going to be in the second one, but you can actually save the inventories with sub-assemblies. Although you can save them with sub-assemblies, you still can't use Symmetry to save them, so you'll actually have to grab two of them out individually, place them down, and then you can actually have the kind of Symmetry. At least they'll both have the RTG generator inside of them now. We are here on the launch pad with quite a mixed match of stuff. Now let's grab Jebediah out here and move him away from the ladder a little bit over to this container. Now Kerbal Inventory System, like we've seen, adds the inventories. So we can right click on Jebediah and we'll have access to his inventory, where if we want we can actually remove his helmet. And if we right click on something else, such as my inventory, which is full of panels, as the name would imply, there are a couple solar panels in here, we can look into this inventory. Now, the same thing like in the VAB, we can left click and drag to move items. We actually have too much space, so let's put some stuff. Let's put our 3 ground bases in this container, and we can actually take the solar panels out. So just by left clicking and dragging parts, we can actually move them between various inventories. Aside from just being able to move stuff from one inventory to another, you can actually move it from an inventory into the game. So if we left click and drag this, you'll notice we have the nice thumbnail again telling us we're holding on to this part. And if we release left click out in the game, then we will get this. Now this is kind of a green shadow of what the part actually looks like. So if we left click, then we can drop the part into existence, and now it's actually here. So let's climb on top of it, and now we stand on our pedestal. If we so choose, we can keep doing this, and we know we can keep adding more and more parts to the game. And the parts are being dropped, I should mention. So if we were to put it at an angle, such as this angle I've created right here, then the part would slide down. They're not actually being attached, they're just being freely dropped into the world. And what you can do is, if you have a clutter of parts, you can hold down the G button, which means grab, and you can see that it's gray when I mouse over something that's not grabbable, and when I mouse over something that is grabbable, it turns green. And if you left click, you will get this shadow again, and you can place it somewhere else. So you hold down G, you grab the part you want, and you get the shadow, and you can move it where you want. Now if you try and move it somewhere that's yellow, that means it's too far away, meaning that you can't actually place it there because the distance is too great. Now, aside from just being yellow, there is an orange color meaning that you can't do something. So green means you can do it right now, yellow means it's out of range, and orange means it can't be done. So we can either keep dropping it around the world, or we can actually, if we set it down for a second, if you click and hold the mouse button. You can release G at this point, but if you press down G and hold down the mouse button, you will keep the thumbnail without picking up the item. And if you have the thumbnail for your mouse cursor, then you can actually mouse over your inventory again and place it back in the inventory. That way, you can kind of pick up all of your parts without the need of just keeping moving them around. Now, aside from just picking up parts, you can actually, when you grab onto them, change their orientation. So if you use the WASD keys, you can actually rotate the parts and spin them so that you can, of course, more finely tune how you want them to drop. So maybe you don't want it to drop at that angle. Maybe you want to place it like this. And then, of course, it'll do a little jump because it clipped into the other part. And of course, when you actually do this, you can hold down Shift, just like in the VAB, to get fine-tuned rotation, in which case your rotations will go by 1 degree increments that you can actually fine-tune how you want it rotated. If your Kerbal is not an engineer and does not have tools, this is pretty much the extent of what you can do. So aside from just these ground bases that we were moving around, we can grab any freestanding part in an inventory or not, but we can't grab onto something that's attached. So if we look at this battery and we hold down G, you'll see can't grab. Part can't be detached without a tool. So if we left click, nothing will happen. Even though the container is technically attached, the reason we can still grab onto it is because it is on this mount. And the mount allows you to actually release the container. So if we grab onto the container and we pull it out into this mode where we hold G and just left click, we can actually reattach it. Because mounting it on a container mount is something that we can do. We can also right click the container mount and release it, or set up an action group to release that for us while we're in flight. You can only mount containers onto the container mount. So even if you may notice, if you grab another part, say we have this ground pylon, and you mouse over, it'll snap into location, meaning that you think you might be able to mount it, but it's orange, meaning that this part is not allowed to mount. So you can't actually mount anything except for the containers, which are mounted onto the container mounts as you might expect. Now this is the full extent of what a Kerbal without any tools can do, or a Kerbal that's not an engineer, since only engineers are allowed to use the tools. So we've seen grabbing and dropping parts with Jebediah. Now it's time to actually look at attaching and detaching parts here with Bill. Now, like I said, the wrench and the screwdriver have a little bit of differences, so we'll show those off. Let's first talk about the EVA propellant because it's a little bit easier. It's kind of a simple thing. What you do is when you right click on it, you can equip it. And when you equip it, you'll actually get this neat little tank back here. So if I push 2, which is the hotkey, you can use 1 through A on these to actually activate them with hotkeys. So if we push 2, we can equip this. And all it does is, after you've expended a little bit of EVA propellant, say we've got 0.25 used, then you can right click this part and say refuel. And what it will do is it will take the EVA propellant from this little part here and actually feed it into your Kerbal suit. That way you don't have to jump back in a pilot seat. You can also grab this thing out of the inventory and drop it somewhere if you want, so that any Kerbal who might need EVA propellant can actually come by, pick it up, and put it in their inventory to use it for themselves. Now, another really neat thing is that if you look at Bill's hands, you'll notice he doesn't have anything yet. Well, let's equip our book here. Oh look, the KIS user guide. We've equipped the book. That's neat. Let's actually also equip our screwdriver. Would you look at that? We actually can equip these parts and they will actually show up on Bill's suit. So now we can see that he's got, if we disable this, he can run a little bit smarter. But now he's got his book and his screwdriver, so Bill is ready to go. Now, what does the screwdriver exactly allow you to do? Well, you remember how we couldn't grab onto this part by holding G? Well, now when we push G, you'll see it says detach, which is the benefit of having the screwdriver or the wrench. So when we left click on it, now we can actually detach it, and of course if we want, we can put it somewhere else. We also get a screwdriver noise played in the background when we detach it. The screwdriver will also, when we're in the grab mode, allow us to attach it. So if we hold down X, you'll notice that it says attach, surface attach. And if we left click, we've actually attached it now. Instead of just dropping it, we actually have attached it to the vessel where it will securely stay, just like in the VAB. This is the same kind of attachment. So what might being able to attach and detach parts mean? Well, let's take one of Jebediah's surface mounts, kind of the ground pylons that he's carrying. So we'll right click on him, we'll say inventory, and we'll actually take one of these. Well, we only want one. We'll split one out just by right clicking on it and saying split. So you can right click and say split if it's a stackable item. So now that we have one of Jebediah's ground bases, let's just place it down. And let's actually switch to the wrench. because the wrench, like I said, it has the same capability of being able to detach parts and then hold X to attach them. When attaching with the wrench, there's actually something you can't do. You can say drop and you can say attach, and if you look at the white text, which is kind of hard to see, it says attach surface attach. Well, you can actually change what node you attach by. So if you hit the R button, it will now say attach bottom. However, the part's turned red and it says this node cannot be used for surface attach. So we can't actually attach this thing. However, if we hit R a couple more times and go back to surface attach, now we can attach it via surface attach with the wrench. If we re-equip our screwdriver, you will notice something different. Let's move the part again so we have a clear view of the node on top of this part. And let's hit R. Now we're going to attach on the bottom. And you'll notice this kind of teal color has appeared, meaning we can actually attach it to this node. And it snaps to this node. So if you look at my mouse, I'm moving it around, it's not moving. It's attaching strictly to this node, just like in the VAB how nodes stick to each other. So now we have this thing perfectly attached along the node just by using, instead of surface attach, we used a node attach. And of course, if we want, we can repeat the process. So we can attach again by the bottom node. So now this tower is actually a well-constructed tower that's attached via nodes, so everything is nice and aligned, instead of being surface attached where it might be a little crooked. Something else that is worth noting is that you can only grab parts that have no other parts connected to them. So if we hold down G to grab something, you can see we can detach this girder segment up here, but we can't detach this one down here because there's already one part attached to it. And it'll actually tell you how many parts are attached to it. So part can't be grabbed because there's one part attached to it. If we go down here, it says can't grab because there's one part attached to it. So because there are parts attached to these two, they can't be grabbed. However, if we detach the top part, then of course we can detach it and we can keep picking them up. And if we so choose, we can attach them again in a different order. The ability to attach and detach parts is particularly useful for something like solar panels. Say you forgot solar panels on a craft, and instead of calling the craft completely useless, you can just pull out a solar panel from the nearest inventory, hold down X in surface attach mode, and then attach your solar panel. And now that your solar panel is attached, if we actually give this vessel some more control by boarding it, we can actually use the solar panel. So now we can extend the solar panel out, and we can start gaining power from it because we attached it to the vessel. Bill has determined that this engine makes his craft a little off balance, so he wants to actually take it off. Well, when I hold down G, you'll notice it's too heavy. It says bring more kerbals. The mass is 1.25, which is greater than 1, because one kerbal can only pick up 1 ton by themselves. However, if we grab Jebediah, who's just sitting idly over here, we can actually move him close, and then if we switch back to Bill, who of course has the power tools, now when we hold G, we can detach it, because we have 2 kerbals nearby within grabbing range of this thing. Bill can detach it, and then Bill and Jebediah can then pick up this engine, and they can move it where they need to, or even if they want, they can attach it to another part. Let's just drop it over there for now because we don't actually need it. And actually, how about we move it a little further away? So we'll grab onto this again, and you'll notice that the range is a little bit low, and that the range keeps getting lower. So even though Bill is still in range, Jebediah is not in range anymore, meaning that we can only move it so far before we have to move both kerbals. But I think this is a safe enough distance for now. So we've demonstrated pretty much everything except the explosives. So let's take this last piece just because, it's kind of in the way, and we'll put it next to the engine, possibly even stick it on top. So let's change this thing to top attachment. We'll change it to attach, and we'll just stick it there. So we don't necessarily want this engine. Let's grab some of these explosives, click them out, And of course, if we want, we can just drop them. There's no real need to attach them. Or we can attach them if we want. We can't surface attach to an engine because normally parts can't be surface attached to an engine, but we can surface attach to this piece up here. So we'll just stick some of these explosives on it. I think 3 should be fine. And we'll right-click the explosives and say activate. Now that they're activated, let's just run for our lives. There you go, perfect debris clearers. Now, Jebediah has also gone missing in action, but I'm sure he made it out safe. So we're not going to worry about him. We did lose all of our parts, so I guess there's not too much more we can do. We can't surface attach to the launch pad because, well, you can't actually surface attach to planets or to buildings. So, with pretty much all of the features wrapped up, let's take a quick look on how exactly this mod might affect the gameplay of Kerbal Space Program, say in a career mode. What you're witnessing right now is me building a small probe just from parts I was able to fit into a box. And the probe, though completely constructed by the Kerbal, is operational and usable. I can control its steering, its throttle, although the steering doesn't have much reaction, but it's a fully controllable probe that was built from parts stored in one of these small inventory boxes. So next up, I've got a plane that has taken some damage. This plane is missing 2 out of 3 tail fins that are used to control its ability to fly. Now, what I'm doing is I'm taking our engineer here, and I am reattaching some of these tail fins to about where they should belong, just to kind of prove a point that these parts, even though you're attaching them dynamically in flight, they still work 100% properly. And what I'm going to show is that even though these parts were attached after the thing is already crashed or landed, that this plane is still capable of flight. It's still capable of steering. Even these parts that have steering, these moving parts, they actually can still steer, and this plane can still fly quite well. It's still very maneuverable, very aerodynamic, and even with a part that's been added on after it was removed. So these parts, the control surfaces, still work 100% even after being stored in a box and being attached after the fact. And you can see I'm even able to come in for a landing and perform a landing with this plane successfully without destroying the plane or damaging it in any way. Now, where the other 2 examples were the ability to build a rocket in space or on the ground on different planets from parts stored in the box, and the second example was the ability to repair an aircraft, the third one is a much more practical application that is one that actually will be used. Now, whenever you're playing career mode, you're going to get these missions that tell you to go and rescue a Kerbal from space or from their heap in space. So I have one of those, just a command pod sitting in space. That's all it is, and that's all it asks you to go. It tells you to go get the Kerbal. So I've brought a box with me with all the parts necessary to get this thing back to Kerbin by itself without actually needing to launch anything else. Now, of course, you could launch this box into space and then use the Kerbal inside the command pod, like what I'm doing, to rescue them. So I'm just attaching a parachute, some RCS, and a heat shield to make sure this thing survives, and I've just let the box be dumped out into space, although I probably could bring it along if I wanted to. And now that this small heap is now constructed properly, I'm able to just use the RCS to slow myself down in the orbit so that I re-enter the atmosphere. And then, upon getting my periapsis low enough to the point where I do re-enter the atmosphere, I'll have a parachute that I attached that will allow me to safely land. And now that my periapsis is low enough, I'm dropping the RCS fuel tank. There's no reason to bring along that extra weight. And I'm just reattaching the parachute directly on top of the craft, and I've also detached the RCS ports. So now this is just a heat shield and a parachute, basically sitting on a command module. And we're going to slowly fall back into Kerbin's atmosphere. So with what looks like it will be a successful recovery mission, this is the end of our mod spotlight over Kerbal Inventory System. I highly recommend you go and check out this mod and even download it and use it, because it's amazingly powerful with the ability to store stuff in inventories and carry it around in a new way versus having to attach it to your vessel to bring it somewhere. Anyhow, this is PTT GRW, signing out.